Imagine yourself tied to a wooden chair, bound so tightly you cannot move. The chair is carried through the streets, jeering crowds pressing close, children laughing, men hurling insults. You are not a murderer, nor a thief. Your crime: you spoke too loudly, argued with your husband, or simply refused to keep silent. Now the whole town has gathered to watch you drown. Not enough to kill you, but enough to remind you who truly holds power. This was the ducking stool, one of the most humiliating punishments reserved for women in medieval Europe. It was not designed to end lives. It was designed to break spirits. A woman could be plunged into icy rivers again and again, dragged back up, coughing, gasping, shivering, while the mob roared with laughter. It was entertainment disguised as justice, and for centuries it kept women silent. But the ducking stool was only one part of a larger system. Across Europe, authorities created punishments not simply to correct behavior, but to shame women publicly, to make examples of them, to strip them of dignity, and to enforce obedience in the most brutal ways imaginable. From iron masks that clamped over the face, to wooden stocks that locked women's heads and hands in place, to public walks of shame that paraded them half-dressed through city streets. Humiliation was turned into policy, and each story, when told in full, reveals not only cruelty but a chilling truth about medieval society, that fear and shame were the sharpest tools of control. Tonight, we'll walk you through the real stories of those punishments. We'll step into the towns and courts where women were bound, gagged, paraded, and silenced. We'll hear the laughter of crowds, the commands of priests, the silence of those too afraid to intervene. And we'll uncover why these punishments existed, who enforced them, and how some women defied them. But before we begin, let me ask you, where are you listening from tonight? Are you tucked beneath a blanket, drifting into sleep? Or sitting in the quiet of your room, letting history's shadows draw close? This is Whispers of History, where the past is not forgotten, and every story leaves its mark. If you haven't already, subscribe, so that together we can journey deeper into the lives history tried to silence. Now, let us begin. The year is 1562. The town of Kingston upon Thames, England, gathers by the riverside. A woman is dragged forward, accused of being a scold. The charge is simple. She spoke too much, too harshly, and too often against men in authority. For this, she is strapped into the ducking stool, a chair mounted on long wooden beams. The crowd jeers as she is raised high, then swung out over the river. For one long moment she hangs above the water, the sunlight flashing on its surface. And then the stool tips. She crashes into the icy current, her skirts ballooning, her body thrashing. The crowd roars with laughter. She is hauled up again, choking, gasping, her hair plastered to her face. Before she can catch her breath, she is dunked once more. This continues until she hangs limp in the chair, too weak to resist. She is not killed, but she is broken. Her voice, the very thing that condemned her, has been drowned in public shame. Records show that in towns across England, women accused of scolding or gossiping were subjected to this ritual humiliation. Men were almost never punished this way. The ducking stool was a gendered weapon, aimed at women who spoke out, women who defied their place. But the ducking stool was only the beginning. In Scotland, women were fitted with iron masks called scolds, bridle, metal cages locked around the head, with spikes that pressed against the tongue. In Germany, women were forced into shrews, fiddles, wooden devices that clamped the hands and head together, leaving them defenseless in the marketplace. And in England, one of the most famous women of the 15th century, Jane Shore, mistress of King Edward IV, was forced to walk barefoot through London in her shift, a spectacle of shame ordered by Richard III. Each punishment, though different in form, carried the same message. A woman's dignity could be stripped at will. Her body was not her own, her voice not hers to command. She was property of the community, to be displayed, mocked, and disciplined as a warning to others. And the most chilling part, These punishments were not carried out in secret. They were public rituals. Townsfolk were summoned to watch, to cheer, to participate in the degradation. Children laughed, husbands jeered, priests prayed over the condemned. Humiliation was not a byproduct of justice. It was the point of justice. In our next chapter, we'll step deeper into the story of the Scold's Bridle. We'll hear how iron and cruelty silenced women in Scotland and England, and we'll follow one case in detail. A woman in 17th century Newcastle, forced to wear the bridle through the streets, her tongue pierced by its spike. History remembers her silence. But tonight, we will give her voice back. The iron was cold, heavy, and merciless. Imagine it being lowered over your head, a cage of metal encasing your skull, with a bar forcing your mouth open and a spike pressing against your tongue. Every movement drove pain deeper. Every attempt to speak drew blood. You could not hide your shame, for this was not a private punishment. You were paraded through the streets for all to see. Children ran beside you, merchants jeered, men spat, and even women, fearing they might be next, sometimes mocked you to protect themselves. This was the Scold's Bridle, also known as the Branks. It appeared in Britain around the 16th century and became most common in Scotland and northern England. It was a grotesque invention, a metal mask shaped like a cage, locked onto a woman's head. Sometimes it included bells, so that her movement drew more attention. But the true cruelty lay inside. A plate, studded with iron spikes, was forced against the tongue. Any attempt to speak caused piercing pain, often drawing blood. The message was unmistakable: silence or suffer. Records from Newcastle in 1567 describe one of the earliest uses. A woman accused of being a common scold was fitted with the bridle and led through the streets. Her crime: speaking ill of the town magistrates. The punishment was designed not to kill her, but to humiliate her, to reduce her from a human being to a spectacle. In 1655, another case appeared in Scotland. Elizabeth Simpson of Lanark was accused of gossip and slander. For this, she was ordered to wear the bridle for several hours, paraded before the townsfolk, the device pressed against her tongue, cutting into her flesh, ensuring her silence. The townspeople followed, laughing, pointing, and jeering, as though it were theatre. When the punishment ended, she was left bleeding, her mouth torn, her dignity destroyed. Even more shocking are accounts of women made to wear the bridle for days at a time, chained to the marketplace for all to see. They were denied food unless someone pitied them enough to slip bread between the bars. Sleep was nearly impossible, the weight of the iron dragging at the neck, the tongue swollen and raw. The bridle was not only a tool of local magistrates. In some cases, it was used by husbands, sanctioned by the law. A disobedient wife, a woman accused of nagging, or one who dared to challenge authority, could find herself locked in iron by the very man who vowed to protect her. This was not just punishment, it was domination given physical form. A surviving example of a bridle, now preserved in a Scottish museum, bears a chilling inscription. Chester presents this bridle for the correction of scolds. It was a civic gift, proudly displayed, a symbol of order. The community did not see it as cruelty, they saw it as justice. But for the women forced into it, it was degradation beyond measure. Their heads bowed under its weight, their tongues pierced into silence. They became living warnings to others. To speak out was to risk the iron, to gossip, to complain, to argue, even to protest injustice. All could earn the bridle. Perhaps the most infamous use occurred in 1650 in Newcastle, where a woman accused of blasphemy was forced to wear the bridle, while being chained to the city's market cross. Witnesses wrote of her blood dripping onto the cobblestones as she struggled, her cries muffled into whimpers. She was left there for hours, exposed to the taunts of every passerby. The bridle served its purpose. It spread fear. Women learned quickly that silence was safer than defiance. And yet, some resisted. There are records of women, once freed from the bridle, spitting at their accusers, cursing them despite torn tongues. Their defiance, however brief, reminds us that even in the face of cruelty, resistance was possible. The scold's bridle faded from use by the 18th century, but its memory endured. It remains one of the most iconic symbols of gendered punishment in Europe, a device created not to correct crime, but to humiliate women for speaking. The ducking stool drowned their voices. The bridle silenced their tongues. Both sent the same message. Women who spoke too much, or too boldly, would be reduced to spectacles of shame. But humiliation was not limited to scolding or gossip. For women accused of immorality, of adultery, of being unchaste, the punishments grew even crueler. They were paraded half-clothed through city streets, mocked and spat upon, forced to perform penance before entire congregations. One of the most famous of these women was Jane Shore, mistress of King Edward IV. When Richard III took the throne, Jane's beauty and influence became her downfall. In 1483, she was sentenced to walk barefoot through London in nothing but her shift, the thin underclothing worn beneath a gown, the streets filled with onlookers as she stumbled forward, her hair loose, her feet cut by the stones. She was humiliated not only as a woman, but as a symbol, a warning against female influence in politics. In our next chapter, we will step deeper into this world of public shaming. We will walk alongside Jane Shore on her day of penance and examine how adultery and unchastity became excuses for the most degrading punishments of all. The year was 1483. London's streets were thick with tension, the air heavy with the smell of smoke from hearths and the sound of merchants shouting in the market. But on this day, the usual bustle was silenced by anticipation. Crowds lined Cheapside, waiting not for a royal procession or a military triumph, but for a spectacle of humiliation. At the center of it all was Jane Shore. Jane had once been the most celebrated mistress of King Edward IV. Born the daughter of a wealthy London merchant, she was admired for her beauty, wit, and charm. Chroniclers called her the merriest of his concubines. Unlike many mistresses, Jane was not despised by the people. She was generous, kind to the poor, and even respected by some members of the court. Her downfall did not come during Edward's reign, but after his death in April 1483, when his brother seized the throne as Richard III. Richard saw Jane as dangerous, not because of her beauty, but because of her influence. She had aligned herself with the Woodville family, Edward's in-laws, and her connections gave her political weight in the volatile months after Edward's death. With Richard maneuvering to secure his crown, Jane became a liability. To neutralize her, Richard turned to a weapon as old as power itself: public humiliation. Her trial was swift. She was accused of harlotry and sorcery, charges so vague they needed no proof. But the punishment was deliberate. Rather than execution, Richard ordered Jane to perform penance, a ritual of public shame, designed to strip her of dignity and reduce her to an object of scorn. On a May morning, Jane was brought from her cell at Ludgate Prison. She wore only her shift, the thin linen undergarment women wore beneath their gowns. Her hair, once styled in elegant coils, hung loose around her shoulders. Her feet were bare. Shackles clinked at her wrists as guards led her into the streets. The crowd gasped. Some jeered, calling her names, mocking her downfall. Others, surprisingly, pitied her. Chroniclers note that Jane carried herself with remarkable composure. Her face was pale, but she did not bow her head. She walked barefoot over the cobblestones, every step a reminder of her fall from grace, every eye upon her. Her route took her through Cheapside, the heart of London, where merchants paused in their stalls to watch. Children pointed, men shouted insults, women muttered prayers. Jane's punishment was not meant to hurt her body, but her soul. It was a theater of degradation, staged by Richard to show the people that a woman who wielded influence outside the bounds of marriage and obedience would be broken. She was marched to St. Paul's Cathedral, the spiritual heart of the city. There, before the clergy and the gathered masses, she was forced to kneel and pray aloud for forgiveness. The irony was bitter. A woman condemned for sins that were accepted, even expected, of kings, was shamed before the altar, while the men who had exploited her walked free. Contemporary accounts suggest that Jane's punishment backfired. Instead of despising her, many Londoners admired her dignity. Thomas More later wrote that she walked in such wise and so fair a favour, that what with her goodly personage and amiable visage, she won the hearts of the lookers-on, rather than humiliating her. The punishment exposed the cruelty of Richard's regime. Still, the humiliation left scars. Jane was not restored to her former life. She was married off to a minor court official, Thomas Linham, and lived in relative obscurity. But her walk of penance remained infamous, an enduring image of how women's bodies were used as instruments of political theatre. Jane's story was not unique. Across Europe, women accused of adultery or unchastity endured similar humiliations. In France, adulterous wives could be paraded through the streets, riding backward on a donkey, their hair cropped as a sign of shame. In parts of Italy, they were forced to wear mocking garments, sometimes painted with symbols of their supposed crimes. In the German states, women caught in affairs were subjected to flogging in public squares. The principle was always the same: humiliation as justice. Women's sexuality was not private but political. A man's infidelity could be overlooked or even celebrated, but a woman's was treated as treason against family, community, and God. Punishments were designed not only to degrade the accused, but to warn every other woman. Obedience was survival. Jane Shaw's penance was one of the most famous in English history, immortalized in chronicles and plays. Centuries later, Shakespeare would allude to her in Richard III, using her as a symbol of both beauty and downfall. Yet behind the drama lies a real woman, stripped of dignity in a ritual of shame staged not for justice, but for power. The ducking stool drowned women's voices. The scold's bridle silenced their tongues. Jane Shaw's walk of penance exposed their bodies to ridicule. Each punishment was different, but the message was identical. A woman who stepped outside her assigned role would be reduced to an example. But humiliation did not always stop at parades or masks. In some cases, it escalated into accusations of witchcraft, trials that turned humiliation into torture, and torture into death. In our next chapter, we will step into the darkness of the witch trials. We will see how women accused of sorcery were humiliated before their neighbors, stripped, searched, and forced into confessions. And we will follow the story of an Askew, an English woman who suffered one of the most infamous humiliations of the 16th century. The crowd gathered not just to watch, but to judge. For centuries, accusations of witchcraft or heresy transformed ordinary women into public enemies, and their punishments were carefully staged to humiliate before they destroyed. Few stories illustrate this better than that of an Askew, a woman whose faith, defiance, and suffering made her one of the most infamous victims of Tudor England. Anne was born in 1521 in Lincolnshire, the daughter of a wealthy landowner. Intelligent and outspoken, she became an ardent supporter of Protestant reform during the reign of Henry VIII. At a time when the king shifted between Catholic tradition and Protestant change, religious loyalty was not only dangerous, it was political. In 1545, Anne was arrested for heresy. Her crime was not witchcraft or adultery, but something equally threatening to the authorities: preaching Protestant ideas and refusing to accept Catholic teachings on the Eucharist. Yet her punishment, like so many inflicted on women, was designed to humiliate her body as much as her beliefs. Dragged to London, Anne was interrogated at the Tower, when she refused to recant. She was tortured on the rack, an instrument rarely used on women. Stripped of her dignity, her limbs stretched until her joints dislocated, she endured agony that left her permanently crippled. Chroniclers noted that her body was so broken she had to be carried to her execution in a chair. But before her death came the humiliation. Anne was paraded before officials, her body maimed, her voice still unbroken. Crowds watched as she was questioned, mocked, and condemned. She did not weep or beg. Instead, she answered with scripture, defying her interrogators, even as her body betrayed the suffering she endured. On July 16, 1546, Anne was taken to Smithfield in London, where she would be burned at the stake. Even this execution was staged for humiliation. She was dressed in plain garments, stripped of symbols of status, her crippled body bound to the post with chains. The crowd jeered as faggots of wood were piled around her feet. Yet witnesses recorded something remarkable. Anne remained composed. Her face, pale but calm, did not betray fear. She refused to renounce her faith, and as the flames rose, she became not only a victim but a martyr. The humiliation meant to destroy her instead immortalized her. Anne's case was unusual in its details, but the pattern was common. Across Europe, women accused of heresy or witchcraft endured humiliating rituals before death. They were stripped naked and searched for witch marks. Their hair was shaved to deny them power or dignity. They were paraded through towns on carts, mocked and spat upon, their reputations destroyed before their lives were taken. In Germany, where witch trials reached fever pitch in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, women were forced to confess under torture. The humiliations were endless. Sleep deprivation, exposure, the stripping away of clothing in front of male judges. A woman's body became evidence against her, every scar or mole twisted into proof of a pact with the devil. One of the most thrilling rituals was the swimming test, used in parts of England and Central Europe. Women accused of witchcraft were bound and thrown into a river or pond. If they floated, it was proof they had rejected baptism and allied with Satan. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned before they could be saved. The spectacle was designed for the crowd. Villagers lined riverbanks, watching neighbors struggle for breath. Their lives weighed against superstition. These humiliations reinforced the power of communities, churches, and courts. They reminded women of their vulnerability, their lack of control over their own bodies, their dependence on men for survival. For the accused, the punishment was not only death, but degradation, a stripping away of humanity in front of those who once called them neighbors. An Askew's story survived because it was written down. Many others did not. Countless women disappeared into the flames, their final cries drowned by the roar of fire and the cheers of crowds. Their humiliation was their erasure, their silence ensured by spectacle. Yet some stories broke through. In Basel, Switzerland, in 1474, a widow named Dorothea was accused of sorcery. She was forced to march naked through the streets, clutching a candle in a mock penance, before being executed. In Würzburg, during the great witch trials of the 1620s, entire families of women were paraded before execution, their humiliation serving as a warning to all who remained. The witch trials revealed the extremes of public shame. Humiliation not simply as punishment, but as ritual cleansing of communities through sacrifice. Women's bodies became stages for fear, religion, and control. And yet, as with Jane Shaw, as with the women strapped into bridles and stools, some of these punishments backfired. An Askew's courage inspired Protestants across England, fueling resistance rather than silencing it. The memory of witch trials sparked skepticism in later centuries, leading Enlightenment thinkers to denounce them as barbaric. Still, for those who lived through it, the humiliation was real, immediate, and devastating. The ducking stool drowned women for speaking. The bridle tore their tongues for gossip. Jane Shaw was paraded half-clothed for love, and the accused witches, women like an Askew, were humiliated in their final hours, stripped of dignity before being consumed by fire. But humiliation did not always end in death. In some cases, women survived, marked for life, forced to live in the same communities that had mocked them. Their punishments became scars on towns as well as on their bodies. In our next chapter, we turn to one of the strangest devices of all, the shrew's fiddle, a wooden contraption that locked women by the neck and hands, forcing them to stand in public squares, sometimes chained face to face with another accused woman. It was humiliation turned into theater, a punishment that transformed quarrels into public comedy and cruelty into entertainment. Imagine two women chained together, face to face, their heads and hands locked in place by a wooden frame shaped like a fiddle. They cannot move apart, cannot avoid each other's gaze. Every breath, every word, every drop of spit lands on the other. Crowds gather around them, laughing, pointing, throwing scraps of food or filth. What began as a private quarrel has been transformed into public theater, and humiliation is the joke. This was the shrew's fiddle, also called the neck violin. The device emerged in the German-speaking lands during the late Middle Ages and was used well into the 18th century. Made of heavy wood, it clamped around the neck and wrists, locking a woman's arms in front of her chest, so she could neither use her hands nor cover her face. In some versions, a single woman was locked into the fiddle, forced to stand in the marketplace as the crowd jeered. In others, two women, often accused of fighting with one another, were chained together, face to face, condemned to endure each other's company until the punishment ended. One surviving example, preserved in Austria, bears the inscription, "For quarrelsome women." The words leave no doubt about its purpose. Unlike the bridle or the ducking stool, which punished women for speech, the shrew's fiddle punished them for behavior, for brawling, for gossiping, for unseemly conduct. The punishment was deliberately humiliating. To be locked in such a device meant exposure. The woman stood in a public square, immobilized, vulnerable, forced to endure the taunts of neighbors and strangers alike. She could not shield her face from rotten vegetables, spit, or stones hurled by children. She could not wipe away tears or hide her shame. Every passerby was invited to participate in her degradation. In Nuremberg in 1537, records describe two women locked into a double shrew's fiddle after a fight in the marketplace. They were forced to stand for hours, their faces inches apart, while townsfolk mocked them. Some threw mud, others forced food into their mouths as a joke. When they were finally released, the women were exhausted, filthy, and broken in spirit. The magistrates recorded the punishment as a success. The women had been taught their place. Another case, from Vienna in the 17th century, describes a woman chained in the fiddle for publicly insulting her husband. Neighbors recalled her weeping as she stood in the square, her wrists bleeding from the weight of the wooden frame. She was left there for an entire day until her cries grew hoarse and the crowd lost interest. Her release came not with dignity, but with silence, exactly what the punishment intended. The shrew's fiddle carried no risk of death, but that was never the point. Like the ducking stool or the bridle, it weaponized humiliation. A woman who once held her head high was reduced to a spectacle. Her reputation stripped away before the eyes of her community. And reputation, in medieval Europe, was survival. A woman marked as troublesome, quarrelsome, or disobedient risked losing not only respect but livelihood, marriage prospects, and even safety. The device also revealed how punishment became entertainment. In towns where executions and floggings drew crowds, the shrew's fiddle offered a lighter, more comic spectacle. People laughed at the sight of two women chained face to face, their argument silenced not by words but by wood. Children imitated the punishment in play, mocking the women long after the event was over. What was agony for the accused became amusement for the community. Yet humiliation could cut deeper than pain. Some women emerged from the fiddle unable to return to normal life. Their neighbors had seen them broken, had jeered at them in the marketplace. Trust was lost, respect destroyed. The punishment ended, but the shame lingered. Artifacts of shrews' fiddles survive today in museums across Germany and Austria. They look almost absurd, oversized wooden boards carved like violins, with holes for neck and wrists. Yet behind their crude design lies centuries of cruelty. Each fiddle once pressed against a woman's skin, each mark of wear telling the story of suffering made public. And while the shrew's fiddle may seem extreme, it was only one form of humiliation. For women accused not just of gossip or quarrels, but of moral crimes, adultery, prostitution, or sexual transgression, punishments became even more degrading. In some towns, prostitutes were forced to wear distinctive clothing, their hair cut short as a mark of shame. In others, adulterous women were whipped through the streets, their bodies exposed to ridicule. The obsession with female obedience ran deep. Every device, every ritual of humiliation reinforced the same message. Women's bodies were not their own. Their dignity, their reputation, their voices could be taken away at the will of men in power. The shrew's fiddle mocked quarrels. The bridal silenced speech. The ducking stool drowned defiance. Jane Shaw's penance stripped away beauty. Anasku's martyrdom humiliated even in death. Together, they form a pattern. A society that turned women into spectacles, binding their suffering to the entertainment of others. But the story does not end there. For some women, humiliation was not the final word. Some fought back, resisted, or endured in ways that left echoes in history. In our next chapter, we'll examine how humiliation was tied to control of women's sexuality, from the public punishments of prostitutes to the forced penances of wives. And we'll ask, when humiliation became too extreme, did it sometimes backfire, undermining the very authority it sought to uphold? If there was one area where humiliation struck most deeply, it was in controlling women's sexuality. Medieval Europe treated women's bodies not as private but as public property, symbols of family honor, religious morality, and social order. A woman who transgressed sexually, or was merely accused of it, became a target for punishments designed not only to shame her, but to strip her of humanity in the most visible way possible. In many towns, prostitutes bore the brunt of this system. They were tolerated, even taxed, yet despised, and their punishment was humiliation. In 13th century France, brothel women were forced to wear distinctive clothing, often yellow hoods or striped garments, that marked them out as sinners wherever they went. In Lübeck, Germany, city ordinances forced prostitutes to wear bells on their clothes, so that everyone could hear them approaching. Imagine walking through a crowded street, every step marked by the jingling of bells, every eye on you, every laugh reminding you that you were different, lesser, exposed. Worse still were the ritual punishments. In Siena, Italy, women accused of illicit sex were paraded through the streets on donkeys, facing backward, their hair cropped short, a mark of disgrace in a culture where long hair symbolized honor. In Paris, some were flogged in public squares, their garments torn away while onlookers cheered. In German towns, prostitutes could be chained to the pillory, forced to stand for hours as crowds hurled insults, filth, and worse. The punishment did not kill them, but it made sure their shame would outlive the moment. But prostitutes were not the only ones targeted. Wives accused of adultery faced equally degrading rituals. In France, adulterous women could be forced to walk barefoot through towns, dressed only in thin shifts, their heads shaved, carrying candles of penance. The shaved head was more than a punishment. It was a scarlet letter, visible for months, marking them as dishonored. In England, one of the most infamous cases remains Jane Shaw, but she was not alone. Records from 14th and 15th century. Towns show wives tied to carts and dragged through streets while neighbors shouted insults. Some were forced to wear mocking garlands of straw, symbols of betrayal. Others were whipped at crossroads, a ritual humiliation meant to display their sins to every passerby. Public penance was often conducted under the eye of the church. A woman might be summoned before her parish, dressed in a white sheet, barefoot, clutching a candle, and made to kneel before the altar, while her sins were read aloud. Neighbors watched, children whispered, and the priest declared her forgiven. But the forgiveness did not erase the memory. For years afterward, she would carry the shame of that spectacle. In Spain, the Inquisition sometimes combined sexual accusations with heresy, forcing women to confess to sins of the flesh in public trials. Stripped of dignity, they were interrogated in ways meant to expose, not protect. And while many men also faced humiliation for moral crimes, the punishments inflicted on women were designed with a particular cruelty to expose their bodies, their sexuality, and their very identity as female. One chilling example comes from Metz, France, in 1477, where records describe a woman accused of adultery being forced to march through town wearing nothing but a shift, holding a heavy stone in her hands as a symbol of her burden. Each step was agony, not just from the weight, but from the eyes fixed upon her. By the time she reached the church, her body trembled, her dignity shattered. Humiliation served a purpose. It reasserted control. Men could stray with relative impunity. Their affairs were overlooked, excused, even expected. But women's sexuality threatened lineage, inheritance, and patriarchal authority. Their bodies were policed with public rituals of shame, ensuring that others would fear transgression. And yet, as with Jane Shaw, as with an Askew, some punishments backfired. Communities sometimes responded with sympathy rather than scorn. Chroniclers record that in Siena, certain parades of adulterous wives turned into acts of pity, with neighbors offering water, shielding the women from the worst of the crowd's In London, Jane Shaw's penance made her more admired than despised. These cracks in the ritual revealed a deeper truth. Humiliation could enforce obedience, but it could also expose injustice. By the late Middle Ages, satire and plays even mocked the very punishments once seen as sacred. Street performers parodied ducking stools and scolds' bridles, turning cruelty into comedy, a dangerous act of defiance, but one that hinted at growing unease with the system. Still, for the women who lived it, humiliation was real, sharp, and enduring. Their voices were silenced, their reputations shredded, their identities reduced to symbols of sin. The spectacle of shame was as binding as any chain, leaving scars far deeper than the punishments themselves. And yet, the medieval world's obsession with humiliating women reached its darkest heights not in the marketplace or the parish church, but in the courts of witchcraft. There, humiliation merged with terror, and women's bodies became both evidence and battleground. Stripped, searched, shaved, paraded, drowned, or burned. The final chapter of humiliation was also the most fatal. In our last chapter, we will return to those trials, to the women who endured the ultimate humiliation of false accusations, forced confessions, and deaths staged as public theater. And we will ask, what legacy did these punishments leave for the centuries that followed? The fire crackled in the square, its heat carrying the smell of smoke and flesh. A woman stood bound to the stake, her garments torn away, her head shorn bald. She was accused of witchcraft, a crime that needed no evidence, only suspicion, whispers, or grudges. The crowd pressed forward, some crossing themselves, others jeering, many simply curious. Her final moments were not private, not dignified. They were staged for all to see, her humiliation complete before her body was consumed by flame. This was the climax of medieval humiliation, the witch trial. Unlike the ducking stool or the scold's bridle, which humiliated women for gossip or defiance, witchcraft accusations humiliated women as embodiments of evil. They were stripped naked, searched for witch marks, shaved to expose hidden charms, and paraded as servants of Satan. The humiliation came before the execution, transforming women into spectacles of sin. In Würzburg, Germany, during the infamous witch craze of the 1620s, entire families of women, mothers, daughters, even children, were paraded through the streets before being burned. Town records describe them walking barefoot, clad in plain smocks, mocked by the crowd. Some were forced to wear conical witch hats, painted with grotesque symbols. Their humanity was erased before their lives were taken. In Bamberg, another German city, women were humiliated in interrogation chambers, bound to chairs, stripped and shaved. They were forced under torture to confess to impossible crimes, flying through the night, coupling with demons, poisoning crops. Each confession, extracted through pain, was read aloud to the community, branding the women not only as guilty but as monstrous. England, too, saw its share of humiliations. The infamous swimming test left women bound hand and foot and thrown into rivers. If they floated, it proved guilt. If they sank, innocence, often at the cost of their lives. Crowds gathered on riverbanks to watch neighbors struggle for breath. The humiliation was twofold: the terror of drowning and the certainty that the ordeal itself marked them forever. The Scottish witch trials reveal even more cruelty. Women accused of sorcery were made to endure pricking, in which their bodies were stabbed with long needles to find a devil's mark. Their nakedness was exposed to male judges, their pain mocked as proof of guilt. They were reduced to flesh and spectacle, stripped of dignity before they faced the pyre. But perhaps the most haunting part of these humiliations was their theatrical nature. Punishment was never private. It was always public, always communal. Markets, churches, and riverbanks became stages for the degradation of women. The crowd, neighbors, family, even children became actors in the performance, jeering, laughing, or praying as commanded. Humiliation was not an accident of justice. It was justice itself. And yet, cracks appeared. Just as Jane Shaw's penance turned to admiration. Just as an Ascu's martyrdom inspired rather than silenced, the witch trials eventually provoked doubt. Some observers recoiled at the cruelty, questioning how humiliation and torture could serve God. By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers condemned the punishments as barbaric, a shame upon Christian Europe. Still, the legacy endured. The devices, ducking stools, bridles, fiddles, remained in museums and town halls, grim reminders of how communities once enforced order. The rituals, shaved heads, public penance, mocking garments, found echoes even in later centuries, resurfacing in moments of political upheaval and war. And the cultural memory, the idea that women's voices, bodies, and sexuality could be controlled through humiliation, lingered far longer. What do these stories tell us? They reveal a world where humiliation was power, where justice was measured not in fairness, but in spectacle, where women's worth was tied not to their souls, but to their obedience, and where entire communities participated in cruelty, believing it preserved order. The ducking stools silenced women in rivers. The scold's bridle pierced their tongues. Jane Shaw walked barefoot in shame. An askew was tortured and mocked before flames consumed her. Prostitutes jingled with bells. Adulterous wives paraded half-naked. Witches stripped and shaved before fire. Each punishment was different, yet all shared one purpose: to remind women of their place. And so, centuries later, when we look back at these humiliations, we do not see justice. We see fear. Fear of women's voices, women's choices, women's independence. Fear that was codified into punishment, ritualized into humiliation, and celebrated as entertainment. History often records kings, battles, and empires. But hidden beneath those grand narratives are the stories of ordinary women whose lives were twisted into lessons, whose suffering became public theater. Their names are often forgotten, except for a few like Jane Shaw or an Askew, but their humiliation shaped the societies they lived in. As the flames of a witch's pyre faded, as the laughter at a ducking stool subsided, as the bridle was unlocked from a bleeding tongue, the message remained: silence, obedience, conformity. But history has preserved more than the punishments. It has preserved the memory of resistance. Women who endured humiliation and still spoke. Women who walked in shame but won admiration. Women who faced torture but refused to recant. Their dignity, stripped in life, was restored in memory. And perhaps that is the final humiliation for the systems that tried to silence them. That centuries later, we do not remember the magistrates who ordered the punishments or the crowds who jeered. We remember the women, broken, mocked, paraded, but never fully erased. This was the most humiliating punishment women faced in medieval Europe. Not one device, not one ritual, but a culture that turned shame into justice and spectacle into power.